lunch and learn of this semester. Grades will be out soon. And anybody who does not respond to giving report card to your professors won't get a grade, get an incomplete. So sure you do that. This is a fun evening and day. There's still a chance. There's an election going on. Everybody know that? Okay, great. Okay, so this turned out to be very lucky that we had a perfect person to talk to us about the state of our democracy and how it might turn out with the elections, or one way or another. Anyway, so our speaker today is Jim Guth, who's Furman's professor of politics, and if that wasn't enough, also foreign affairs. Jim?
Okay. Thank you very much, Dennis. I'm going to start out with just a few kind of bullet points here about some things that are relevant to the question of the impact of the election on our functioning democracy. I just was reading an article this morning in the Washington Post about attitudes abroad about the nature of American democracy. And it was very interesting to see that when people abroad are asked about whether America's democracy is functioning well or not, the number of people who say it's functioning well has declined rather dramatically over the last 10 years in virtually every country.
Thank you for stepping in.
Something like a democratic system itself. And
Exclamation point.
Indeed, in some of the
I know it's a lot of
Anglo-American
moving
democracies,
parts.
as we like to call them, the concern with the process of American
But
democracy
everything
is especially strong. And of
Seems
course,
perfect.
here at home, we have a lot of discussion about just those same kind of issues. So I'm going to talk about some of the kinds of questions that have been raised about our current political situation and what the election may mean for that. And I'm going to try to be fairly brief so that we can have a lot of time for questions and discussion. One of the first, and maybe not the most important thing in the nature of the topic, is whether we're going to have a functioning Congress or not, or whether we're going to have another example of a stalemated legislative body. One of the things that I think a lot of Americans are not aware of is how much the U.S. Congress has become a basically non-active body. In the past 10 years, even more in the past 20 years, the number of laws that have been considered by Congress has declined dramatically. Congress has held many fewer hearings in committee to consider legislation. The number of bills that have actually passed has declined dramatically. And the amount of time that Congress and members of Congress spend on what we might think of as a legislative workload has declined dramatically over that period. What has also declined is the adherence to what devotees of Congress like to call the regular order, which is what you might think of as the schoolhouse rock theory of legislation. I guess most of us are a little too old to remember the schoolhouse rock theory, but it goes, you introduce a bill, it goes to committee, there are hearings held, there's a markup session on the bill, there's a vote on the bill, it gets reported out of committee, it goes to the floor of the House, it gets voted on, and then it goes through the other body, the same procedure. That's the regular order. Congress doesn't work that way anymore. The only way Congress works now is the leadership of the president's party in the House and the Senate get together with the leaders of the House and the Senate and maybe a committee chair or two, and they write bills from scratch. And these get passed by one House and then sent to the other House, and the other House passes them without really much in the way of elaborate consideration as of the old style. Nobody says they like this. Nobody thinks it's a good system, but nobody changes it. And so one of the questions you have is, if there is a new Republican majority in the U.S. Congress, will we have a return to the more regular order? And the answer is no, we won't. Even though there has been some effort, for example, give me one example of this, is passing the federal budget. The historical method for passing the budget is that in each House, 12 appropriation subcommittees hold hearings, mark up bills, send those bills to the floor, get them passed, send them to the other House. We haven't done that forever. Instead, we have a big, gigantic, continuing resolution that gets introduced and gets passed with various modifications negotiated by the leaders. The minority party usually tries to stand in the way of it passing and just threaten to shut down the government. But nobody ever really looks at the entrails of those bills, what used to be 12 different bills. I don't think that's going to change. We're not going to have a more routine and a more elaborate and more effective congressional process, no matter who wins this year. Also, I think a Republican victory is likely to lead to the expansion of various undemocratic practices, such as investigation and legal action against political opponents. This sort of started in a way with Trump's lock her up. Remember that during the 2016 campaign? And of course, the Democrats impeached Trump twice, and the Justice Department may end up taking him into court. A Republican House is already threatening to go after President Biden, maybe impeach him, maybe impeach the Secretary of Homeland Security. In any case, they're going to investigate everybody, Hunter Biden, down to the last Democrat anywhere. The persecution of political opponents is a characteristic of an undemocratic society. And unfortunately, we're working ourselves into this cycle. I'm not saying that President Trump shouldn't have been impeached, but nevertheless, what we have is a kind of cycle of potential prosecutions, I think, that we would be well advised to try to avoid. And it's especially concerning that we see the same pattern developing in a great many American states, where people in power and a party in power in one state is bringing action against their predecessors in court to try to throw them in jail for some policy decision that they made. I think this is an unfortunate development, and I don't think it's likely to be ended by the outcome of the election today. I think also the elections will tell us whether or not the kind of denialism that Trump and the Republican Party have created has really finally undermined the traditional rules of the game, where losers concede, if not graciously, at least willingly, to the mandate of the ballot box. We have a lot of Republicans running for office out there right now, and some Democrats who have refused to pledge that they're going to accept the result of the election. We'll know in 3 or 4 days how many of these cases actually end up with such a contest. I think there's also a less visible, perhaps to most of us, but nevertheless still disturbing tendency on the left, not to necessarily contest the result of elections, but to contest the legitimacy of the entire American constitutional system. There is a fairly large component, for example, in the House of Representatives, the Progressive Caucus in the House, among Democrats, who are making a fairly consistent argument that the American constitutional system is inherently racist and unfair, is undemocratic because we have a Senate that is not based on proportional representation, and a president who might be elected with a majority of or minority of the popular vote. And this developing intellectual movement on the political left, I think, in some ways is just as big a long-term threat to the legitimacy of the American political system as what the Republicans are entertaining themselves. Obviously, we're going to know whether we can have a nice, peaceful election. I was telling Dennis, there were no armed guards or people in camouflage at my polling place this morning. I don't know. I hope that's the case all over the country. Everybody at the election the precinct was very civil, very friendly. It was an old style election. I saw some neighbors there, talked to them, and they probably voted differently than I did, but nevertheless, we were rejoicing in our mutual condition as American citizens with a vote. I just hope that will be the case across the country. And of course, we've already seen indications that it might not be, with lots of threats against election officials, some violence against election officials, and other such activities. But within a day or so, we'll know how serious those changes were. Okay. Trying to shift my PowerPoint doesn't seem to want to move there. Whoops. Now I did something really bad.
Share it again.
Yeah, it's the wrong one though. I need to get the next one. I wasn't moving up.
Okay.
I tried the page up and
Let's do that. Does it go here?
it's not moving.
Huh.
It ought to be moving.
Yeah, I'm looking at all these. Let's see. This isn't my computer. How do you usually do it? Oh, there.
Just a page down, yeah.
Huh. Keep talking. I'll be back.
Moving to the next slide and then going back into the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Or we can get the slide up without going to PowerPoint if we can.
Yeah. So how did you do before? Did you stop the share?
Well, let's try it. Can I exit it?
I don't know where your little menu is. Oh, no.
Let's move to the second one.
Did we just turn the Zoom off?
See if we can click on the second one. Will that do it?
Yeah.
Or move to the next slide.
There.
Okay, there we go.
And then,
I gotta
yeah.
get back to the
Yeah, where's slideshow? That's what,
Now, are you sharing it? Hi, everybody.
don't know. Don't know what we did. He couldn't get it to move. Here.
It's not moving. We'll just keep talking here.
I
Yeah.
don't know.
Okay.
Don't know what I did.
It's here. Let's not mess it up. We got it here.
Well, let's make sure the people at the Zoom have it.
Okay.
Keep-
Well, I'm gonna read what it says, so here we go. I think it's also important to know as a result of this election, whether we're going to have major efforts to try to revise our electoral systems around the country. We have had, of course, a lot of discussion. Democrats have been complaining for the last few years that Republican legislatures are passing new election restrictions, which dampen the votes of minorities and other Democratic voters. Republicans, of course, claim they're just making elections safe and secure and honest. And on the other hand, of course, we have some arguments that if various election officials around the country are elected, election deniers on the part of the Republicans, that we may have a number of different provisions, especially in presidential elections, the so-called legislative supremacy theory, where state legislatures, rather than voters, would determine electoral votes for president for their states. That was one of the things that the Trump effort at a coup attempted to try to get state legislatures to elect electors after the election had actually taken place. These are some real concerns, I think. On the other hand, most of the Democratic claims that Republican electoral changes in the last 2 years are very effective in reducing access to the vote are simply not true. There's been all sorts of studies that show that none of these laws have had any effect on reducing the vote. In fact, they seem to have actually increased the vote. So it's a pretty good electoral claim for the Democrats, but it doesn't seem to have much impact. On the other hand, some of the kinds of things that are going to be considered if Republicans win state legislatures, like this change in the electoral college procedure, are, I think, very dangerous. And so that's something to watch if we end up with a lot of governors and secretaries of state and legislatures who are convinced by the argument that state legislatures ought to choose the electors from a state. Another long-term problem that I see, and this is something that's not new, is I think this campaign has really further damaged the quality of electoral discourse in the United States. And I don't think there's any way to deny that. A number of studies by political scientists have shown this year an almost complete dominance of negative advertising by candidates. Almost invariably, candidates on both sides are running against their opponents, and quite often with charges that are far-fetched and spurious. They use harsh and demeaning campaign rhetoric. One of the things that I was struck by one paper I read, it was looking at the number of times the terms fascist were used by Democratic candidates, and radical socialist and other things were used by Republican candidates against their opponents. And these are, true in both the political ads that we see on television and in various kinds of social media. And this trend continues. I think the deterioration of American political discourse. It didn't start with Donald Trump, but he sure gave it an awful good push during his two campaigns for the presidency. Finally, and this is something that's a little more subtle, I think this campaign is going to also tell us something about the qualities that Americans want in their leaders. There's a new book out that I haven't even read yet. I've just read a couple of reviews, has come out, that argues that American politicians have become noticeably dumber over the last few decades. Having observed American politicians up close over the last few decades, I think that's probably the case. I think there is probably less collective intelligence and even more, perhaps less collective knowledge among our national politicians than there's ever been. Donald Trump here is a pretty good example of that. Somebody who, according to even his own associates in the White House, knows nothing, cares nothing, and is not willing to learn anything. But he's not alone. There are a great many other members on both sides of the aisle in Congress who are not what we would think of as professionals in the best sense. This is in part due to the fact that we've increased, both at the state legislative level and in Congress, the rate at which the membership turns over. At one time, of course, Congress was a pretty steady institution. You had a relatively small influx of new members each election. When you had 50 new members coming in, that was really a big tide of new members. And you had people who were quite experienced in their areas. Committee chairs who had been in their subject matter jurisdictions for a couple of decades and knew the ins and outs of public policy. Today, we have a lot of people who have no political experience whatever coming into Congress. We have we have two leading Republican media stars are former bartenders. We have one leading Democratic media star who's also prior job was a bartender, and other people who have had no previous political experience whatever either. And this does not augur well, I think, for the possibility that we'll ever return to something like the regular order, because most of these folks are not really interested in sitting in their seats in the committee room, working for 8 or 10 hours a day on substantive legislation. They're much more interested in their social media feeds where they attack the other side or carry on one or another sort of rant. And I think not only is this a problem, but it also, this kind of politics makes it much more difficult for the system to attract able people into American politics on both sides of the aisle. Just this year, for example, most of you are probably aware, there were a number of leading Republican governors around the country, popular governors who were sensible people, successful governors, who refused to run for the U.S. Senate from their states simply because either they didn't want to be the target of Donald Trump's diatribes, or they simply didn't want to engage any longer in the kind of rancorous politics that we're fostering in this country. And their decision not to run, I think, was a great loss for the country. And there are similar examples, although I think they're less numerous this time around on the Democratic side. And so that kind of tendency, I think, is related to some of these other things that we're looking at. What's the answer? There isn't one. I'm not sure what we can do in large sense, to reverse most of these trends. I was tempted to look at a new book that has just come out on how countries get out of polarized politics. I was especially intrigued by the title, How Countries Leave Polarized Politics, by the fact that I can't think of a whole lot of them that have. So it was a kind of a small sample of examples that the United States might learn from or draw on, but I may be wrong. There may be more out there than I'm familiar with. But in any case, I think that we'll have more clarity, somewhat more clarity after the election results are in. It'll apparently be a while before we really know what the state of the Congress is going to be after the election and the state of most state governments. But I don't see any easy remedy for many of these processes or tendencies, which have been in the works for a long time and have been kind of accelerating as time goes on, and in which we have a kind of ratcheting effect, in which one party or one side adopts a new tactic and the other side goes one better. And that doesn't de-escalate the polarization. And of course, a lot of this is based, these things are based on what we seem to want from our politicians. We collectively as the American public. We're after all electing these people. And until Americans decide that they're going to reward different kinds of characteristics in our politicians, I think we're going to continue to see some of these tendencies rear their ugly heads election after election and between elections as well. Okay, I don't know if I made my watch won't tell me whether it's 20 minutes on or not, but in any case, oh, there's one back here. I did it right on time. So there we go. I've got plenty of time for questions and comments, slings and arrows, whether out of outrageous fortune or not. That's a little Shakespeare there, you know. So yes, sir, back.
If we went second, hold on. If we did away with the electoral college and just went to the raw numbers, wouldn't that eliminate a lot of this BS that's going on now? Because people would just sit in their house and watch the numbers, and there wouldn't be anything on January the 6th. All of that would be eliminated. Yeah,
The problem is, how do we get there? You know, we do have a constitutional amendment procedure, which requires that we have 2/3 of both houses of Congress and 3/4 of state legislatures to ratify a constitutional amendment for a presidential election. I have a hard time imagining the political situation in the United States in which the Democrats, it would be primarily Democrats, who'd control 3/4 of state legislatures and 2/3 of both houses of Congress, or be able to get enough Republicans to go along with the idea to amend the Constitution to eliminate the Electoral College. There is an effort, and it's kind of a problematic effort that might be more feasible. It's an effort to pass an interstate compact that states would sign on to, agreeing to cast their electoral votes for the winner of the national popular vote. Okay, everybody put your head around this now. This is kind of complicated, but it would go into effect as soon as a majority of electoral college votes states had signed on. So as soon as you had 270 whatever electoral votes by states signed on to this compact, it would go into effect. So those states automatically would give all of their electoral votes to the winner, regardless of who won in their state. Okay, pretty neat, huh? So, and that wouldn't require nearly the broad backing that a constitutional amendment would. Now, there's a problem with that. It's not clear that the courts would consider that constitutional or not. So, you know, a lot of difference of opinion on whether or not that would actually work. But that would be easier to change in that sense. But there was, for a while, there was actually, there's some progress being made toward adoption of the compact. I think they were only like 70 electoral votes short. But it's the whole process has died now for one reason or another. I'm not sure why. But that's the one mechanism that might work. There are, of course, efforts to have a new constitutional convention. People on the left would like to have a constitutional convention that would make the Senate, you know, not by state, but simply by some kind of district of equal sizes, like the House is. And of course, that's not going to pass either. And on the right, there are people that like to put all sorts of weird things in the Constitution. So they want to call a constitutional convention, but I think we probably ought to avoid a constitutional convention if we can manage to do that. Look what happened the last time they tried to call a constitutional convention. We got a brand new one when they were going to amend the Articles of Confederation. Yes.
I never thought of the idea that you had said of having everyone agree that all the electoral votes would vote for the national level.
And that's really going to the same thing the Republicans are claiming they can do with the current electoral college, right?
So is a variation to that being talked about that the states would say that we'll cast all of our state electoral votes to whoever won within.
Yeah, that's the idea. That's the national, that's the notion.
Let's say whoever the national
Winner is gets those states who have signed on to the compact. It's an agreement among states that their state legislatures are bound to vote for the candidate who won the national popular vote.
Okay, but is a variation of the state is bound to vote for whoever won within the state?
Well, in theory, that the states are bound to do that now. But see, what they would do, let's say that Texas signed on to this this compact. Texas isn't going to, but let's say they did. And we had a national vote in which in 2024, Joe Biden beats Donald Trump again in the national vote. But Donald Trump won in Texas. Well, according to this compact, if Texas were a party to it, they would have to cast their electoral votes for Joe Biden. They couldn't cast them for the one who won their state's popular vote.
And can I just check and ask you, if you wouldn't mind for the Zoom people to just repeat the question as you answer it?
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
More questions? Oh.
How much of our estimation of current politics is because we're looking at the past through rose-colored glasses? I mean, I started a political career in Jersey City, in Scranton, Pennsylvania in the 70s. The judge of election in Scranton pulled the gun on the poll watchers because he didn't want them to check the counters on the machines at the beginning of the day. And in Jersey City, they normally beat the living crap out of any people from the opposing party.
Wanted to vote
there
Republican.
show up at the polls. We had presidential candidates accusing their opponents of being in league with the communists or about to start a nuclear war with Russia. I mean, are we really that much different than I look at what we were when I was in my teens and 20s, and frankly, I think we're a lot better today than we were there. Orders of magnitude in a lot of different areas.
Yeah. I think the question is, are we really different today, or are we just complaining because we think things are bad now, but they were bad at times in the past as well? I think there are a lot of things that, that's correct. I think in terms of electoral security, electoral fidelity, we're a lot better off. I mean, there's no doubt that in 1960, Dick Daley stuffed the ballot boxes in Chicago so that John Kennedy won the state of Illinois. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. And machine politics, you described very well what machine politics meant. You discouraged the other people, sometimes physically, from casting ballots, and you had your folks vote 5 times. You know, the old Chicago saying, vote early and often, you know, if you're in the right party. So we're a lot better off now. And, you know, we've always had in the past, right from the very beginning, you know, the Jefferson Adams campaign was a really nasty campaign. And we've had periods in which members, you know, caned each other almost to death on the floor of the House of Representatives. But I think still, if you look at so many of these features, you see we are different today. If you look at the Congress, for example, you discover one of the things that has really changed is that members of Congress, Republicans, never, ever exchange anything with Democrats. Republicans in the House have no Democratic friends. Democratic friends have no Republican friends. They don't interact with each other. They don't socialize with each other. They don't even talk to each other. That is something that's different. And that may have something to do with the fact that now we give them money to go home every weekend instead of making them stay in Washington and, you know, do their work. And the fact that they're not in committee where they actually have to deal in small groups with people on the other side. Just lots of things have changed to make this possible. But I think in that respect, we're a lot worse off than we were. And even in terms of campaign rhetoric, if you look over time, you know, sure, we've had people making, you know, Joe McCarthy accusing the Democrats of being communist, and we've had these episodes. But if you look at campaign documents and that sort of thing, you just don't see the same predominance of negative campaigning that you know, candidates used to, in fact, have a list of things I'm going to do when I get to Congress. And, you know, now it's things my opponent will do if you don't elect me, right? And they're all things that probably their opponent isn't going to do, but sound really bad. So I think in a lot of these things, you know, we can always find precedent in the past, and there are really ugly episodes in the past and electoral instances where you had nasty campaigning, but it wasn't, you know, constant and pervasive, and it didn't extend literally to every institution. And I think that's what's really changed, is that we've become thoroughgoing antagonists in a way.
Oh, there we go. Oh, there we go. Get your fingers off.
I was looking at Washington Post today. It says U.S. democracy flies towards competitive authoritarianism.
Mhm. Yeah, well, that's what we've been doing here. Yeah. Are we becoming authoritarian like everybody else in the world that's subject to authoritarian tendencies? This is actually something I've done a good bit of work on. You know, there are a lot of rather disturbing cross-national comparisons that one sees in comparing the United States with right-wing authoritarian movements in Europe, in many European countries, for example. They, you know, the Trump Republican Party has many of the same kinds of themes and characteristics that the Alliance for Germany and the Brothers of Italy and the National Rally in France, and, you know, on and on and on. Many of the same electoral themes, many of the same tendencies to demonize opponents, you know, a lot of the same characteristics. And so there are a lot of comparable factors. Now, when political scientists started looking at this, they spent a lot of time looking at it back in 2017 and 2018 when Donald Trump just became president. And we all were sort of saying, well, you know, that's true. But in the United States, we've got lots of institutional checks on authoritarians, right? Well, not so much maybe. If you have most of the Republican Party buying Donald Trump's authoritarian viewpoint and his behavior, and they win elections, you know, that institutional check is gone. If Mr. Trump has appointed most of the federal judiciary, including a majority on the Supreme Court, and they agree with him, that institutional check is gone. And so, you know, you begin to worry a little bit. I guess I'm still a little bit optimistic that, you as long as we have elections, and of course, that's one of the questions we're addressing. We're likely, I think, to head off the worst of those tendencies. But I think the question is well taken, that we can certainly see some very, very similar tendencies on the part of the United States when we look at other countries that have these same kind of movements. And in some ways, it's a little more frightening because in a two-party system, when one of the parties goes right-wing populist, that's worse than when the fourth party in Germany goes right-wing populist, or the second party in France goes one way, right-wing populist. So maybe it's not as easy to slough off that comparison as we might like to think. So.
Like not the solution, but one of the reasons is the lack of education. And I feel like our democracy is in trouble because we have generations of people who aren't doing critical thinking, who aren't making decisions based on information. And I've been in education for much of my life, but I think that's where, as a democracy, whichever way you are, whichever way you lean, left or right, if you're making decisions based on intelligent information gathering, and rather than just following the person that you like, or the way that they look, or the energy that they have when they speak. Isn't it true that Abraham Lincoln was a terrible speaker?
Yeah, and he wasn't real pretty either.
Yeah. All those things, we sort of let go of our, as a democracy, as a people, an ability to think critically, and have depended more on these less important characteristics. That to me is the solution. I think it's long and it's hard. It might take a generation.
Yeah, what's the role of education in all this? Somebody who's taught college students for a long time, I can guarantee you that there's been a diminution of the amount of information that high school graduates have about almost anything, American government or chemistry for that matter, I assume. And that's a matter of great concern, especially when you have in so much availability of false information. And that's what's really different, I think, in our current situation. We have ready access to information which is just not right, not correct. And in a day when nobody had access to anything except the daily newspaper or Time magazine or Newsweek or the evening news broadcast, you didn't have a lot of just ridiculously idiotic ideas being perpetrated and permeating through the entire society. Today it's much different. And I don't know how we, under the First Amendment freedom of speech, how we go about reversing that. I'm just struck with the fact that we have so little civic information available, even to college students. College students are, ought to be the people who are going to be the leaders in the future, but they seem not to have acquired much relevant, maybe have to do with the diminution of civics in American government education, high school. We know a lot of states don't require any kind of civics education anymore, and I'm not sure what the answer is there, but certainly that's one element.
To what extent do you think the press adds to the divisiveness and the discourse? If you listen to only MSNBC, or if you listen to Fox, and you get all your news from that, or maybe from a social media site, you don't think. And I think that seems to drive some of this polarization and so.
Yeah. Role of the media. I think that's a major factor. At one time, we can all remember Of course, there are various periods in American history where the media was partisan to begin with. Newspapers were the Globe Democrat or the Springfield Republican, right? But even so, they reported news, that wasn't that different, especially if they depended on a wire service during the 20th century. It was the same stories. They had different editorial policies. But today, of course, we get different sets of facts from different media sources, and people pick the one. We have a great tendency, you all know, for confirmation bias. We don't want to hear stuff on the other side. And there's even some evidence that political psychologists have discovered that when people listen to political arguments from the other side, they're even more entombed in their own viewpoint. They don't really tend to consider the opposite side, but they just dig in a little deeper on their side. So part of it's on us too. I mean, we choose what we listen to, and we choose whether we take things seriously or not. Now, I tend to be a kind of a middle of the road person. And so I can tolerate stuff from either side as long as it's information based. But I'd get really tired listening to Fox, I'm sure. And I do get tired when I listen to MSNBC, and I get tired listening to the NewsHour on TBS. And I say, well, where's the Republican voice? We have all of the stuff on the left, but we don't have anything on the right. And, I have my classes do a little content analysis of 3 weeks of the NewsHour, and it comes out pretty lopsided. Well, yeah, but it costs $200. I just got my subscription notice. It's going to be $223 a year next year. So unless you have a research fund like I do, you can't accumulate economist subscriptions. But you're right. I mean, that's a great news source for most of the world.
In trying to find out about different candidates, it's like you should research the candidate and where they stand and what have they done. Very difficult to find any information on any candidate. I don't know where to look. But my real question is, years ago, the Supreme Court had a case that suddenly made it very legal for big money to get into politics. I forget the name.
Citizens United case.
Yeah. What impact has that had on the advertising?
Well, I'm not sure that it's had, we have so much money washing around American politics these days. And one of the things that political scientists have discovered is that a lot of times money chases strong candidates rather than the other way around. You want people who are going to win, and you want them to be indebted to you. And so you give to people who are likely to win. But there are these, Citizens United especially made it possible to support some of these kind of dark PAC kinds of things that are able to spend money independently that tend to do some of the more negative of the negative advertising. And so I'm not sure that they've changed much the distribution of Republicans and Democrats. What they have done is they've certainly lowered the quality of political discourse a lot. Because that seems to be their forte. They love to do the negative campaigns. And that has been the effect, I think the major effect of that kind of money. But, the Democrats had their big money too. George Soros got multi-million dollars into various Democratic causes, and there are several other Democratic multi-millionaires who, especially if the Democrats are doing well, they tend to get, a lot of cases, the Democrats in this election cycle, a lot of Democratic candidates have raised a lot more than Republicans have. And so it's, not been something that has been uniformly a Democratic or Republican advantage. But I think what it has done is it's changed the way candidates run for office.
Jim, what are the requirements, if you are a candidate for office, if you're not financially, what can you do or not do? My question.
You can spend all the money, your own money that you want for any office. So, and we have in the US Senate in the last 2 decades, we've had at least 20 maybe 25 members who were elected entirely on their own dime, who, spent their fortunes getting elected to Congress, to the Senate. There were some House members who elected themselves in that way or supported themselves. But there are campaign restrictions on how much you can take from individual contributors, restrictions on how much you can take from political action committees. But other outside groups can spend money independently as long as they don't coordinate with your campaign. And there are virtually no limits on independent expenditures.
Except for foreign governments.
Well, yeah, but they do it anyway, right? The Russians are interfering. We finally found that out. They admitted it yesterday or the day before. But they're not subject to campaign finance laws. So.
Last question.
Good question. In the primaries, when I went into vote, they asked you which party.
Yeah.
And I stated my party, and this man that was standing by the door started screaming at me, yelling at me. And the lady behind the table just, mouth gaped open, and I took my thing quietly, and I just forget it. What was I supposed to do? What was she supposed to do when somebody's standing right inside the door? He wasn't voting, he was just standing there.
Well, he should have been removed, but if, well, you call the police force, so in the local jurisdiction. Yeah, call them and tell them there's somebody disrupting a precinct here. It's a violation of state and federal law. And luckily, I hope we're not seeing any of that here, but we'll hear reports of that around the country, I'm sure, tomorrow.
Okay, Jim, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, what a timely conversation. We'll see you later, Zoom.